Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Elizabeth Bonawitz. She is a cognitive scientist whose work is especially influential because it connects deep theoretical questions about learning with concrete implications for education. At the core of her research is a deceptively simple question. How do children figure out how the world works? Rather than treating learning as passive absorption, her work shows children as active learners who explore, test hypotheses, revise beliefs, and use social cues to decide what information matters. I'm so excited to have this conversation today. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to today.
Yeah, I mean, it was so interesting because I was really excited today because I was thinking about learning. And now that, we're adults, we've been able to have this inner monologue for decades now. I, I kind of have normalized one particular way of learning that has a lot to do with speaking to myself, analyzing, interpreting. But when I was reading up on some of your work, I forgot that there was a point where I just came out the womb. I didn't know anything. I didn't have a way to speak or understand myself. And I was still learning. In fact, I probably was learning the most back then, if anything. And I find that to be so fascinating. So I'm very excited to get into the nitty-gritty details of how that even happens. But I would first love to know some of your origin stories and to just know how is it that you found yourself fascinated, particularly by how really young children learn.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually changed my major, I think like six times in college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I started as a music major because I loved music, and I thought, well, I can't do this as a job. I'll do it as a hobby. And I switched to math and business, and I bounced around. I took philosophy classes and computer science classes and psychology classes. And what I was really trying to find was sort of a way that could combine, I think, some of the architecture and ways of thinking that you get in math and computer science with some of the behavioral ways you approach questions and the topics that you explore in psychology, with some of the deep analytical ways you can approach a problem in philosophy. And it turned out by the time I was a senior, a professor said, we have this new major that's called cognitive science. And it turns out you've basically taken all of the courses that would be requisite for this new cognitive science major. Do you want to just be a cognitive scientist? So I didn't really know that there was this field that existed that combined all these other disciplines that I was already hovering around. I was just sort of following my interests in college and sort of stumbled upon it that way. When I was in after undergraduate, I went and worked in a lab, Josh Tenenbaum's lab at MIT, who is a computational cognitive scientist who was studying the sort of ways that you could formalize how learning could work. And I really was excited about how I could explore those questions with children, because to me, children are the most incredible learners that we know about in the universe. They're learning so rapidly, so quickly. And so I basically decided for graduate school I was going to apply this sort of computational cognitive science approach to study children's learning. And that's sort of the way I wiggled into it.
Wow. And so when we talk about differentiating between children's learning and adult learning or other forms of learning, how do you what makes those two different?
Actually, one of the things I do is study about all the ways in which actually they're very similar, and they're the same, in fact, because the underlying mechanisms that are there in place in childhood to support learning are the mechanisms that lead us to be scientists and adults who understand how to explore and make explanations and predictions, and be curious about the world. And so actually I'm sort of interested in the common themes of sort of the architectures of the mind, and how sort of domain general is a way we might say it, the mechanisms that are there early on that support learning throughout the lifespan. Of course, you mentioned at the beginning there's things that are changing throughout development. You talked about learning by thinking. Your example was sort of in your own mind, you wonder about things, you explain things to yourself. I'm fascinated by learning by thinking. I think it's so cool that we can come to what seems like new knowledge without any new data from the world. And I study that in childhood too. But you're right that without language, or without as much richness in our what we'd say executive function or planning mechanisms in our mind, that kind of more explicit learning is not present, say, in an infant. But nonetheless, the sort of approach I take is really about the ways in which learning is consistent throughout the lifespan.
Hmm. Can you expand on that? So learning is consistent. So the is it the ways in which we do it, or is it the kind of speed and rapidity in which it happens?
So, for me, what I'm interested in is building a model of the black box that is the human mind. So, we get some
Mm.
input, there's something that's happening in the mind, and then we have some output. Maybe we have some new knowledge, or we do some kind of behavior, we say something. And what I want to do is I want to study and understand, like, what are the sort of algorithms that could explain how we get from the input to the output? What are the rules of thought that are happening inside that black box? And so when I say that learning is sort of the same, what I'm saying is the rules of thought are basically the same. From the things I'm interested in are studying the ways in which the rules of thought are basically the same from early childhood through adulthood. That being said,
Wow.
there's lots that does change as we get older. So, for example, we're able to hold more things in our memory, and that means that we could maybe process more information more rapidly, or in a different way. We learn new strategies for thinking, and that might change the sort of particular plan or approach we take to solving a particular problem. We also are changing what our knowledge is. And so, although I might say the rules are sort of the same, the kind of underlying knowledge that's supporting your belief revision is changing throughout the lifespan. And so that's also going to affect, say, the kind of behaviors and outputs that you see. So that's a sort of very technical way of saying, like, the sort of approach that one takes as a cognitive scientist is really trying to figure out, like, imagine the mind is like a computer. What are the algorithms or the rules that we think that computer is following that's going to allow us to get from point A to point B?
Mm. Mm. I mean, this is so interesting because I feel like I studied a bit of philosophy when I was in undergrad, and some of the things that I think was really life-changing for me was simply just learning what fallacious forms of thinking were and reasoning were. Because I think that actually really helped me without, it wasn't something I actively did, but taking logic courses, taking those courses kind of shaped the ways in which I reasoned through the world. But it's interesting because would we still consider that as a similar form of thinking, or is that now all of a sudden a very different form of thinking as earlier?
Yeah, there's so many layers to knowledge and to thinking. So, one example might be, the human visual system. When we get data, we get, light that hits the back of our retina, and that's just a two-dimensional depiction of the world. And yet we see the world in three dimensions. And so there's Fourier transforms and all sorts of complex calculus that's happening that allows our mind to actually get a transformation from that two-dimensional picture to representing three dimensions in the world. So my
Wait, time
job,
out, time out.
yeah,
Sorry, what we see through our eyes is being registered in through our retinas in 2D. Is that what
that's
you're
right.
saying?
Your retina is flat. It's
Oh.
just a wall. So it's just a projector that's got a
Ah.
bunch of different lights and colors hitting that wall. And what our brain is doing all the time is saying, okay, well, wait, I see depth, right? I see something closer to me or
Yeah.
farther away. And so our brain is doing actually really complicated calculus, right?
Wow, I
It's
did
doing
not
really
know that.
to be able to resolve, the world as three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional. And so it's taking, for example, the position of our two different eyes and the fact that our two different retinas are getting slightly different images juxtaposed, right? That's one of the things it's doing that allows us to see what things are closer or farther. So no one would say, like, wait, as I get older, I learn calculus, maybe. And so because I've learned calculus, does that mean I should be able to see better or see in three dimensions? Like,
Hmm.
we're talking at sort of different levels of description here. So the level I'm talking about is sort of what are the rules or the algorithms that the mind is just using naturally, that allows us to process information, that allows us to help take into account what my expectations were, what I'm seeing, and how to interpret those two things together. And that's sort of one level of explanation of learning. But then there's all this other stuff that we do that makes us uniquely human and very cool, which you're hinting at, right? Which is the fact that we can reason about our reasoning. We have something called metacognition. So we're thinking about our own thinking. And so that is a really cool thing that humans do. And sometimes that thinking about our own thinking can help us learn something new. But sometimes we think we know what we're thinking, or we think we know why we've done something, but we're totally off. We have no idea, right? We're
Mm,
generating explanations all the time for our behaviors without it actually linking up to any real description of what's happening, and as the process is happening at a much maybe subconscious kind of level. So
mm,
those are all really interesting, deep questions, sort of maybe at the heart of cognitive science, even questions of consciousness and learning. And so when I'm talking about learning, I'm sometimes talking about that sort of analogy to the retina, right? That we're doing something sort of subconscious that we're not aware of. This is the rule or the algorithm that makes sense that we're probably processing. But then there's also this fact that we sometimes can do this thing called metacognition, or sit and think about, well, why did I think that? Or why did I make that prediction? Or what else could there be? And I can do this much more conscious kind of behavior that helps me learn and think about the world.
mm. Okay. As you were talking, I was trying, this came to mind. I'm so excited to hear what you think. Okay. So when I think about what I kind of want to maybe try to define what learning even means, and maybe thinking about the different steps that happen in learning. So in my experience, this is kind of how I'm feeling it. So I think at first when you experience something, there is something that happens there between, let's say, a professional athlete watching their sport versus like a layperson watching the sport. Because what you even perceive can be so different based on how complex, how much you understand the complexity that exists there. And so I feel like learning has all these pieces. One, there's like the perception of the experience itself. Then your ability to remember. So whatever you did just experience, can you like store that somewhere in memory? And then not only can you store it, then can you retrieve it? And then once you retrieve it, are you able to now think about it after the experience has happened and reflect on it and maybe bring it back into in the right time, bring it back up to the front. And then there's also I wrote gene. What does gene mean? What could I have wrote
Your
for G?
your biology predisposition,
No,
maybe?
that's not what I wasn't trying to talk about genetics. I was gonna say, I was gonna say generalizing. That's what I was writing. So
Mm.
generalizing. Once I have, okay, like because that's another whole complex thing. Because let's say you touched the pot and it's hot, and you're like, but then your brain could be like, oh, it was hot that one time, and it would only be hot that one time. Your brain has to now say, there's something about the essence of a pot when it's sitting on that stove that exists every time that happens. And so the generalizing piece is also really important. So it feels like there's so many layers to this learning equation. What are, yeah, is it all
That's
learning?
that's right. That's right. It's all learning. The pot question is interesting, right? Because you have to know: is it all pots? Is it just this pot? Is it the stove? Is it that it was this moment? This is sort of Quine's problem of is philosopher talking about how to carve up the world, and how we even know like what a word might apply to if we see if we see a label for an object. So what the kind of learning that I'm really interested in is how children and adults form and revise intuitive theories. So, abstract representations of the world that guide our ability to explain and predict. And so, one of the actual, I was just seeing whether I have. So you can see on my shelf, I've got turtles stacked on top of each other. There's actually a logo for my lab, which is three cute little turtles stacked on top of each other. It's sort of family friendly, but it also references this old story about its turtles all the way down, which is a sort of physics. I don't want to get too much into the story, but it's referencing the fact that the kind of learning that I'm interested in is actually learning at many, many levels simultaneously. So you can, for example, flip a coin and learn something about this particular coin. Like maybe it comes up head. I learned that the outcome was head. But then I can have a prediction about like, well, is this coin fairly weighted or not? Like, is this a coin that is actually a trick coin, or maybe just not doesn't flip with perfect? And so I can start drawing inferences now from many flips about this particular coin. But simultaneously, I can also inform my theories about how coins in general are distributed in the world, or whether there's things like fair coins or not fair coins. And you can keep building broader and broader sort of meta theories going all the way up or all the way down, depending on how you want to think about it. And so when you're talking about this problem of like, what am I learning when I touch a pot, right? right? And this problem of generalization. One of the ideas is that generalization comes from the fact that we have these causal intuitive theories about the world. And so that allows us to figure out like what are the variables that are relevant to lead to this sort of outcome. And be able to extend and generalize and explain the world as a result of starting to pull out those kinds of layers. And so in my early work, I studied this a lot, and I've been coming back to it in the last 5 years or so because I think this idea of how we build our beliefs that are these rich causal beliefs that allow for exactly these deep problems of generalization are really the most interesting ones.
Yeah. And so you mentioned intuitive theories. What classifies under the branch of intuitive?
So, this is a way that we talk as scientists sometimes. We want to distinguish intuitive theories from, say, in like history of science and philosophy, or from actually like scientists that are building rigorous theories of the world using data through experimentation. Intuitive theories are the idea that just from birth, right? We're starting. We might have some predispositions or some beliefs already early at birth, but we at least start building by very, very early childhood intuitions, abstract, causal hypotheses about how the world works that allows us to predict and explain the world. So, an intuitive theory could be about the fact that people behave based on their desires and their beliefs. So, I can predict, for example, that if mom thinks that the cookie is in the cabinet and she wants a cookie, then she will go over to the cabinet as opposed to the fridge. And as a little kid, even 3 and 4 year olds can reason about the ideas of like, why are people doing what they're doing? Why did mommy go to the fridge instead? Oh, because mommy thought that there's the cookie was in the fridge, or because she didn't want cookies after all, right? We can start using our intuitive theories that are maybe broad, abstract stories about, say, human behavior, or that was one example. That's one domain. We can reason about biology or physics or all sorts of other domains in the same way. But that guides our explanations and our predictions about the world. So as a kid, I can predict where I think mom will go based on what I know about her and what I think she knows and what she wants. And I can reverse infer, oh, maybe she didn't want a cookie after all when I see different kinds of data. Those are the
Yeah.
things that guide our reasoning in the everyday world. And so I'm fascinated by how we form those beliefs at the abstract level and the ways in which we revise them throughout the lifespan.
So would you say that when kids form, first, I was also just thinking earlier about the methodology of how this is studied, or so what are some of the research projects looking like in this space?
Yeah, so let me give you one concrete example. So before children are 4 or 5 years old, they have sort of a strong bias or prior that causes can't cross what we call domain boundaries. So there might be like the psychological domain, how we think and feel about things. There could be the biological domain, how we feel in our bodies, or growth or illness. There's the physical domain, like throwing a ball and where it's going to bounce or land. So they might, for example, say that being worried can't cause something like a tummy ache because you're crossing domain boundaries from psychological to biological. So they deny like psychosomatic illness, for example, as one kind of domain boundary. And so one question that we had was, well, how do children learn to revise this belief? And so what we did was we gave children storybooks that had ambiguous evidence. So in one set of storybooks, for example, there's a character Bambi that ran in different locations. So Bambi ran in the cattails and ran in the pine trees and got itchy spots. And the next day, Bambi ran in the cattails and ran in the garden and got itchy spots, and so forth and so on. So it could be that Bambi's getting itchy spots from the pine trees on the first day and the garden on the second day. But if children are sensitive to this sort of statistical probability of the data, this evidence that's starting to build for the fact that cattails is there every single time that Bambi gets itchy spots, then we would expect them to say, well, Bambi probably got itchy spots from the cattails. So we can set up the same kind of story in a domain where they have strong prior beliefs against that recurring causal variable. So we tell them a story about Bunny, who eats a popsicle on day one and feels worried about giving show and tell and then gets a tummy ache. And on day two, Bunny eats a sandwich and feels worried about show and tell and gets a tummy ache. And on day three, Bunny eats some cheese and feels worried about show and tell and gets a tummy ache. So here, it's perfectly possible that the recurring cause to us as adults is the feeling worried. But the question for us was, given that children have this strong prior belief against feeling worried, can they still learn from this sort of statistically ambiguous but more likely evidence?
Whoa. Huh. That's so interesting. So, that's so interesting.
So we
Okay, because
tested this with 3 and 4 year olds, and what we found was that 4 year olds were able to overcome their prior beliefs. They started to actually endorse being worried as the cause of Bunny's tummy ache, but they didn't endorse it as strongly as when it was the Bambi storybook, and they didn't have those strong prior beliefs working against them. So they learned from the data more strongly in the sense that they were more likely to endorse the recurring cause in the Bambi case than they were in the Bunny case. So two things are at play here. And this is sort of the heart of the sort of Bayesian work that I do. One is that you have strong prior knowledge and that guides, what kind of hypotheses you might consider and the degree to which you think they're likely. But you're also able to pay attention to the data. And this comes out in a term called the likelihood. So you say, well, what's the probability I would have seen this outcome given if this model were actually true? And so children are combining both of those kinds of knowledge, both like what was my a priori belief in this and how compelling is the data to what we'd say rationally come to a posterior belief or the degree to which they should
mm,
believe some new hypothesis given the data that they've observed, given those prior beliefs. So it's sort of nice because it means that if you show up at the science museum and suddenly an object is floating in midair, you don't throw out all of your theories about physics and how gravity works, right? You start thinking, well, maybe the magic show, is happening right now or something else is going on, right? And so a little bit of data is not sufficient to overturn really strongly held beliefs. But if you have weakly held beliefs, a little bit of data could be compelling. And so there's this interaction that's happening that allow us to update our beliefs in a way that we would call rational.
mm. I wonder, something that has really fascinated me. So I studied math in undergrad as well, and pure math. And one of the things that completely changed my life is until that point, I had always just thought a squared plus b squared equals c squared because there's no reason. It just is, right? I mean, it never occurred to me, why is this the case? It just happens to be the case. You're supposed to learn it. But once I started studying pure math, it was fascinating to me that starting from why 1 + 1 = 2, everything had to be proven to some extent. I mean, starting and you when you have that, the beliefs that you hold, the higher order beliefs that you hold are now much more strongly held because you have a very particular reason for that. But I think often what ends up happening is, which is why I think a lot of flat earthers are able to kind of hold their beliefs, because not many people actively know the reasons for why the earth is round. I mean, I couldn't really tell you why. If you asked me to prove how the earth is round, apart from saying, hey, these people took photos, I couldn't really tell you methodological ways in how I myself could prove that the earth is round without having to like resort to somebody else. And so that means when somebody questions that belief, it becomes so much easier. So I guess why I'm saying this is I wonder how many beliefs we hold as adults simply because we read it in a book or we were taught it in school versus us actually having proof to believe in it. Like your example of gravity. I don't know the proof behind how to know gravity works. That particular theory, I know when I drop things, it falls, but I don't know how to prove the theory of gravity. I don't know, And so when somebody brings up another alternative, unless I know the proof, all I can say is, well, I read in the book, you must be dumb. You must be, how could you possibly say something else? I read it in the science book. You have to be wrong. That's the only way I can defend it because I don't actually know why I believe it. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the one of the great benefits of humans is that we're social beings, and ways in which our science and technology have advanced, a sort of ratcheting effect, as Tomasello, one of a famous psychologist, has referred to it, is because we can actually trust expertise in others. Is because we don't actually have the ability to spend all of our days in these more complex domains in technology and science, all learning all of the disciplines to do all of the proofs. We actually have trust in testimony. We believe in expertise of others, and hopefully we know how to assess the expertise of others, which is a whole other political debate one could get into. And that actually is really, that's an efficient thing, right? We don't want to spend all of our time worrying about all of the details of all of these proofs as adults. We want to be able to trust and diversify our expertise. That's a great tool that we have that's led to the advancement of society, according to many evolutionary psychologists. So it's a good thing. And even kids are actually sensitive to testimony of others. They, first of all, can tell whether or not they should trust someone else based on whether or not past information that that person has given is reliable or not. So if that person labels something wrong that the child knows that's not a cup, they know to ignore it. They know that expertise can differ across people, so they're more likely to trust the testimony of a plumber giving you information about how the toilet works, and more likely to trust the testimony of a nuclear physicist telling you about how a rocket works, right? And to flip flop those, and they also know how to balance the testimony of others with their own experiences. So if they're exploring the world and taking actions, and they see something working a particular way, and someone else says, "Well, actually, it works this other way," children balance that the same way that, in the same sort of Bayesian terms, that we balance our prior beliefs with the data. We say, well, maybe I was wrong, but maybe you're wrong, and now I've got uncertainty. And so all of those are things that we are built into our learning system, which is really a feature, not a bug. So that's one piece to it. I keep inhibiting myself from telling a flat earther joke. I'm like, sorry, it's just bubbling in the back of my head, which is like, if I may, for just a minute, and then it will get out of my head and I can go back to science. But the argument is that the Earth actually is flat, and the way we know this is that the Earth is 80% water, and all of that water on Earth is still, it's not sparkling. So that therefore the Earth is flat. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, we can get back to science now. But no, I'm not endorsing flat eartherism. Let me just. So actually, the testimony of others is a really powerful way for us to learn, and in fact, that's one of the sort of cornerstones of learning, is that people can just tell us how it is. The problem is when we don't know whether we can trust the testimony, or we drop our critical lens for a moment and we don't think like, wait, is this a reliable source, or is this video I'm seeing really real, or is it AI generated, or am I just in an echo chamber? Being able to step out of these, as I think you referred to them earlier, the logical fallacies that can lead us to want to get comfortable in our beliefs without actually thinking critically about them. That's when we start going awry and start, unfortunately, leading to incorrect scientific theories or beliefs about the world. But testimony is a great way to learn. That's one of the three pillars that I talk about in my own research.
And what are the three?
So testimony is one. The fact that we can explore the world and generate our own data. Testimony is actually related to two things. There's testimony where someone actually tells you the way things are, but you also learn by watching other people. So if someone else takes an action on the world, that gives you a lot of data about the world. But we learn through our own actions, our own experiments, and exploration, and playing in early childhood is a great way to discover the world. And then the third thing is learning by thinking, how you started this off with, the fact that we can actually explore in our own mental state and reconsider beliefs that we had, and think about alternative explanations for the data.
And I think it's really fascinating because have you seen either across cultures or either across just different populations, the weight placed on one of these is more in some groups of people as opposed to others?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I'll just put a caveat that I'm not a cross-cultural researcher, but as a developmental psychologist, I do talk to many people who do the really hard work of actually doing cross-cultural work. And in my own class, I teach a class on curiosity. And so I'm very fortunate to have students from all over the world who just reflect on their own educational experiences. So it's certainly the case that in some cultures, there's do as I say, direct instruction. I'm going to give you testimony, read the book, memorize, rote. And that's a kind of learning approach that's used in those kinds of in other kinds of countries. In the United States, it sort of depends on the school and depends on the state, but there's lots of schools, Montessori schools and other schools that are much more about active exploration and much more independent play. And then there's schools that sort of balance that provide scaffolding that really want children to be active, question asking, inquisitive. Um, and those different kinds of learning can lead to different kinds of traits in adulthood or different kinds of strategies. So if you want a population where the kinds of jobs that they're prepared for are showing up on time, carrying out like rotely memorized sequences of tasks, then learning in a system where there's a lot of direct instruction and you have to practice those skills could be beneficial. If you want a population that thinks creatively and with curiosity, then you might want to do something that's a more blended approach where you're giving a lot more opportunity for the child to explore via explanations and discussion and dialogue. Importantly, with scaffolding from the teacher so that they know where to focus that attention. So it's certainly the case that different cultures have different priorities, and the educational systems look very different, even within the United States.
I mean, I think this is why it's so fascinating because from what I know, the mind itself, the brain itself can change its, to some extent, its the way it functions based on the types of things that are valued. And so when you look at adults based on even how these three different uh would you call them like learning pillars, how they would, which ones, based on which ones are valued, the, given enough time and kind of reinforcement for a particular pillar, the mind itself will change. And so later it feels like that was just the way it was meant to be if you only look at one particular culture, which is why I think it's so fascinating to understand. I think to understand these things at a human level, it can only be done cross-culturally, right?
Yes and no. So, yes, if you're interested in these more contextually specific experiences or habits of mind or the kinds of behaviors that we're sort of exhibiting broadly in the world, maybe from a more educational perspective, but from the cognitive science perspective, there's no reason to believe that the sort of biological processes of the mind are going to be any different in one culture over another, right? There's no reason to believe that the retina system works differently if you were born in Shanghai versus Rio versus Montreal, right? So there's reasons as cognitive scientists that sometimes what we're asking is a sort of basic science question about like what are the mechanisms that can explain how this kind of learning works. And so it makes sense to have a convenience sample to test the population that is near you or that is cheaper, that you can trust the data that you're getting because you don't have to worry about, is this culturally sensitive or have I translated it appropriately? Because there's reason to believe that those much more basic mechanisms are universals. And so those need to be tested in the context of like, well, what if their prior beliefs are different? So you might want different, ways of training people to have different beliefs so you can test your model in a particular way, or you might want populations that come in with different prior beliefs. But that doesn't necessarily mean, from a cognitive science perspective, that I need to test someone in Shanghai or Rio or Montreal in order to trust that my model is right. So there's sort of different layers of explanation, right? Physics is still going to be physics, whether or not you're testing it, in Australia or the Canada, right? And certain aspects of cognitive science are still going to be, I think, universal. But there's lots of interesting questions you can ask when you do ask cross-cultural questions, and many people do, as a result, do that kind of work. It's just slightly tangential to the kinds of questions I'm asking.
Mm. And so, how would you say the findings of your research or a lot of the things that are found in this field about understanding what learning is and how it works influences how pedagogy then functions?
Well, I mean, I don't, it's a good question whether or not my basic science work translates in practical terms. I hope it does as a faculty that's, sits in the Graduate School of Education, though with affiliation in the psychology department. Um, the kinds of things I'm trying to understand are, what are things that explain why children behave the way they do in particular tasks or circumstances. And if we can explain why, then we can start to understand how to best optimize learning for the fact that learners are actually coming into classrooms with all sorts of diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds. And so, my goal is to provide a sort of theoretical and explanatory account of how learning works the way it does, so that we're better able to sort of approach educational settings. That doesn't mean that from a policy perspective, from a structural perspective in schools, teachers are going to be able to necessarily implement the suggestions I might have, because they might not have the resources, the time, the support. So, one example is the fact that we know from my work that coming in with different kinds of prior beliefs. So if I believe, that blocks always balance at their geometric center, but you believe that blocks balance under their center of mass, that the same kind of evidence will be interpreted very differently from both of us. And one thing could support learning in one case and not in the other. Um,
Oh,
and so, one thing we'd want to help teachers understand is, children are coming in with different kinds of beliefs into your classroom. They might have different beliefs about how things work. And so, the same evidence that helps student A learn is not the same evidence that helps student B learn, right? They're going to need different kinds of evidence to support their discovery or their belief revision here. They also have different expectations about teaching. So when a teacher asks a question, sometimes with the intention of teaching, something I call pedagogical questions, children with experience in pedagogical questions from, their own parents, from having a more guided sort of play learning experience in their early childhood, those kids are more motivated to explore on their own and discover new things when that question is asked. But when a different child who comes from a different household that doesn't have a lot of experience with questions but always gets direct instruction suddenly hears a pedagogical question from a teacher, they don't explore as broadly and they don't interpret it in the same way. They have different prior beliefs that are guiding their interpretation of what the meaning is behind this question and what the goal is for them as learners. And so those are different
wow.
expectations. One is at sort of a belief level that's supporting like knowledge getting restructured, and the other is at a belief level that supported like appropriate behaviors in a classroom, or what it means socially when a teacher does this or does something. And so those are all different kinds of knowledge that we're bringing to the classroom. And one of the things that I would, stress for teachers is that kids are actually building these intuitive theories about the world. They're very rich. They giving them chances to explore and explain is really important. But also, kids come in with different beliefs, and so if there's a way to sort of understand where you're meeting them, different kinds of evidence might be differently helpful for them.
Wow. And so understanding what I'm hearing you say is a lot of like having a pretty thorough understanding of what people's prior beliefs are about a particular topic or an action, and then using that to then inform the ways in which you think about learning and teaching.
That's right. Like the kinds of evidence that would be most effective for them in the case of like the blocks when I was talking about, right? Different kids might need different evidence there to help overturn their beliefs. In the case of the expectations, then different kids might need different guidance around like, okay, well, in this classroom, right? When I ask questions, what I want is you to ask questions too and you to explore, and that's safe. This is a safe place for you to do that, right? And so creating other ways in which you can help um, equalize the playing field for those
Oh,
kids
so
so that
I mean, this is interesting because when I think about my particular education, for example, I don't know how much of what I learned. I mean, I don't remember too much of first grade and second grade, so I'll just take some examples from. I think I've fallen in love with science over the last few years, and that's a really broad word. What does that even mean? But I am really fascinated I think growing up, I was a terrible student. So I feel like I'm in this unique place where I don't have a lot of the basic foundations. But I've done all these other things, but I don't have some, especially in the sciences, I don't have a lot of my like basic knowledge of like well, how an atom works, I mean, kind of the foundations of science. And I think one of the interesting things though is as I got through those classes though, I read what was on the book. I know that I would pass the class if I was able to properly kind of communicate what I read in the book. I didn't have to actually hold that belief myself. I didn't have to actually believe in what I was reading. I didn't have that inform my world. You could have said anything in those pages. You could have said water is a solid and I would have been like, okay, water is a solid. Anything you wrote in those books, I would have then been like, but I don't know if it necessarily changed my like belief. And so even when it comes to teaching, how do we know whether we're just asking somebody to regurgitate something without actually internalizing it or whether they actually have?
That's a really great question. I mean, as someone who's, again, studying much more about in early childhood, what are the sort of intuitive theories, which are not even things we're teaching, right? You don't teach an intuitive theory, you're building them out of your own experiences in the world, your own sort of priors. It's a very different set of questions than I try to grapple
Mm.
with. But I think the question of like, um, how do we know if, the kid in the science classroom, maybe they have flat earther parents and they're reading that the earth is round and they know that for this test they have to regurgitate that data. How do we know that they really believe that? I don't know. Hopefully the textbook is set up in a way that gives compelling evidence to deny that. But if the textbook doesn't even realize that you might be having kids coming in that have, say, those prior beliefs, then it might not be designed to say, okay, here's all the ways in which you can prove that the earth is round. It might take for granted as a starting point that everyone
Wow.
is okay with that predicate, right? So again, here's one of these places where, understanding what are the actual beliefs of your students coming in so that you can address them through effective data and evidence is really important, I think, in those particular cases. I mean, one of the challenges I think is actually not just about, whether I believe what I'm reading, but we talked again about this idea of testimony and whether or not we trust the testimony, right? So it's not clear to me why a child, coming in with, parents who believe that the earth is round and might have all these other supports in place, why that child wouldn't trust the data that they're seeing that it is, right? Because you've already got that prior belief. You already believe that science is a reliable discipline and that these are sources that can be trusted. But if you're coming in skeptical with parents who say, oh, you can't trust scientists or you can't trust what you learn in school, then you might get a kid, right, who weighs that testimony, that weighs that direct instruction from the teacher, the text in the book, against the belief that it's not trustworthy. And so, why would I revise my beliefs in that case? And so, maybe I'm going to learn how to kind of tell you what you want to hear as a teacher, so I can get an A, but that won't actually change my beliefs. So, those are two different kinds of uh, meta processes that are going on, right? That are about like the degree to which I have faith in what I'm learning. One is about this idea of whether I can trust it and what my expectations are there, and then the other is whether or not we're giving evidence to the kids that they need to hear if they're coming in with a different set of beliefs in the first
Mm.
place.
And the only way to know this is to get some sort of temperature check of what people's prior beliefs are, which is not something I've seen done very often. And I think can actually be extremely helpful because, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are teachers that do pretests, right? That take that at the beginning of a semester, beginning of a year. They say, okay, let's start out and see where we're at, right? This isn't going to count towards your grade, but I just want to see what we're working with here. And that is a technique that's often used. Especially because there's often summer drift that happens where children forget a little bit
Yeah.
about where they were
But
3 months prior. So that,
I
I mean, I'm sure there are good teachers out there that take that as part of their
that do that.
yeah.
But I guess again that's more of like prior information rather than a prior belief, right? Like it's like what like which I think is different where because you had mentioned earlier also like what are people's prior beliefs on pedagogical questions, for example, like which would be like what is how many questions are you asked at home, about these different things, which isn't like it's not like a test or something you can, answer necessarily. It's not what do you know, but who are you and what do you see in your other environments, which I feel like is very different.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. So those are different kinds of cases. I mean, it depends what your goals are as a teaching and in the moment and in the classroom. I will say that in my classroom with, 30 master students from all over the globe that are coming in from very different places, one of the things that I'm trying to teach is for children to children, for the students to actually be able to ask their own questions, to raise their hands, to feel comfortable speaking out, to get into discussion and disagreement with each other. I really want a flipped classroom where, they've all read the readings coming in, and I can create some opportunities for debate, and we learn from talking to each other a lot. But in order to get there, what I have to do is create a safe space and a fun space. So I have, right off the bat, have to make sure that they know that they can trust me, that I'm not going to judge them for saying something that they might deem as stupid, but to me is just an opportunity for growth or learning, right? And so there are things that I do that, even if, one student is coming in from an experience in their schools growing up in Malaysia where they were told, like, if you ask a question, it means you're not prepared and you're going to be in trouble, right? Because you shouldn't be asking questions, right? That student is going to have a very different perception of what the classroom is supposed to be like than the student who grew up in, Chicago, outside Chicago, where the teachers are saying, ask as many questions as you can. We love that. We love that. Let's do that, right? And so my goal is to try to normalize, at least within that my classroom, right? In that moment, everyone's experience. So we say, for all of us, here's my expectation. We're going to support each other. We're going to be, I want to see you asking questions. And when they ask questions, I have to follow through. I have to be like, I'm so glad you asked that. That's great. One thing teachers have done, for example, is I've heard of Post-it notes. So everyone gets a Post-it note, and you have to ask a question and play your Post-it note. So you can look around and say, like, oh, you haven't asked your question yet. I can see you still have your Post-it note. So it normalizes the behaviors that you want to see. So things you can do in the moment in the classroom that can create a sort of equal footing for all of the students, even if they don't necessarily think that then applies in other situations, which actually could be a good prior to have. It might not apply in other situations that they're used to. That will at least help support their learning in the moment with me.
Interesting. And so I guess, as we start wrapping up, I mean, something I want to ask you is in the example that you gave, I think that's a phenomenal one, kind of reshaping how someone views asking questions. Because I think this exists in so many places that it's become something I'm personally really fascinated by, people's relationship to asking questions, whether it's on one-on-one dynamics, whether it's in work settings, whatever. How do you, what are the methods in which, let's say I do it in my classroom, but the person ends up leaving going, oh, this professor was so amazing, but I'm not going to do this anywhere else. But in this one classroom, I feel comfortable asking questions because this one professor allowed me to feel like it was. But that is not something I now have changed my like fundamental relationship with. Are there ways in which you can, cause change that's so much more at a core level than just like in like that pot example? How do you make that change so it's for all pots and not just one pot?
That's a good question. For the child that's coming in, that's being punished for talking back or asking questions or disagreeing, um, it's not the case that I want to send that child home,
True.
right? In that context, right? Because now we're just teaching them to act up. But I would want them to know that I at least was a safe place, right, where they could experience that, and hopefully, the teachers or places that they would experience as they continue to grow offer that opportunity. Um, kids can work out a lot on their own as well, and when they get that experience of like, oh, this is different from what I've had before, we're drawn to novelty, right? We find things that are surprising draw our attention, and so that kid will be thinking about that, and will be thinking about, like, how do I put myself in that context more if I like it. Um, so, it's a hard question to ask. It's one I'm not, I think, um,
Yeah.
trained to answer.
No, for sure, because you don't want to change a belief that doesn't actually hold true for the other environments that they're in, because that could actually. But I mean, I think some of this stuff is really interesting, and I have one or two last questions that I want to throw by you because I think the theme of curiosity, which your research also covers, is an extremely important part of this. And I just wanted to first, because I was reading a little bit and I thought your definition of curiosity was really fascinating. But can you expand a little bit more on what curiosity is?
Yeah, so from my there's as many ways to define curiosity as there are scientists saying that they have a definition for curiosity. So let me just say that there's a lot of disagreement about what curiosity is. Is it one thing? Is it many tangible things? For the work that I do, the kind of curiosity that I'm interested in, sometimes referred to as epistemic curiosity, so curiosity about knowledge or beliefs. Um, uh, the questions that I'm interested in are sort of what guide our learning, what guide our attention to relevant data, what allows us to like encode data more effectively, like how do we seek to explore the world to discover new things. And so um, the analogy that I sometimes use, I got this term from uh, Kathy Hirsch Pasek and I think Brenna Hessinger Doss and Roberta Golenkoff and others have a paper where they talk about mise en place for learning. And they're talking about setting the stage for a learner to sort of optimize their chances. And they're talking about guided play and other kinds of benefits. Mise en place is a term that's used in cooking. So when you're getting ready to cook some dish, it's a sort of a French term where you lay out all your ingredients measured ahead of time so that they're ready to go. So that when you're in the moment of cooking, you've got everything you need already at your
Mm,
fingertips. And so for me, curiosity is the mise en place for learning. So what curiosity is this heightened awareness in the moment that I'm about to get new information that's going to be relevant for me. So it gets the mind geared up. So I'm ready to start attending to what should be relevant. I'm starting to pull in my top down knowledge, my prior beliefs. So I'm ready to match up that evidence with my knowledge so I can see if it's consistent or not consistent. And that will help allow me to revise my beliefs or look for alternative explanations or all the kinds of tools we have when we see surprising evidence. And it's basically like getting the engines running. So curiosity is like, here I am. Let's get the memory systems going and the attention systems going and everything linking up. We're ready to go so that now when this data is about to flow in, I'm ready to absorb it, or so that now I know what kind of action I want to take in the world, so that I can gather the data that I want to gather, right? And so for me, that's what curiosity is. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've worked with talented postdocs who are. Katarina Begush is someone who's a faculty now at University of Copenhagen, and she studies a brain response called theta waves. So that's using EEG recordings, the electrical recordings that are happening in the cortices. And so that's theta is active and particularly strong when children are expecting information. And we think
mm,
theta is the sort of one of this sort of signatures of curiosity because it's tightly linked to reward centers, to memory centers, to planning centers, all the things that you would want to start getting linked up if you were about to get some new data and need to encode it and think about how it relates to your knowledge and think about planning your next steps as a result. So we've studied that
mm,
with very young kids, and we've seen that, for example, when we show children evidence that's surprising or evidence if they are about to see evidence. So you see two blocks that might light up a machine, and in one case you know you're going to learn something, in the other case you're not. You see greater theta activation in the case when you're about to learn something, and even 18-month-olds are sensitive to this kind of thing. So that's the way I think about curiosity. It's the sort
interesting.
of engine revving in the mind that's getting ready for that new information.
And how would you differentiate between curiosity and just simply being motivated? Because again, like I think another example is the difference between and I don't know if you would make this distinction, but I feel like there's a difference between a curious student and a motivated student, where a motivated student may not actually care at all about the actual core of the information, but they're really motivated by the college or by their profession or whatever, and so they're like, I want to learn this. But they don't really care what the information is. Where a curious person, you could turn off the grades, you could turn off the profession, and they would still, with the same amount of fire, learn it. Would you just say those are two different would you say those two are equally curious?
Yeah, so the way that, philosophers have defined sometimes curiosity is without the extrinsic motivation, right, or without the promise of reward. And so the question is like, when am I motivated, even if I don't think that there's any other tangible reason for this, for me to care about this besides the knowledge itself, that knowledge is its own reward. That is a way sometimes people think about it. I actually think it's a really complicated interplay of systems because reward actually signals importance. And there's studies, Emily LeQuinn and Tanya Lombroso and others have a study about like how if something's more important, we actually get more curious about it, or we at least rate ourselves as being more curious about it. So there's feedback loops that are happening here, right? Like my motivation to do well in school might actually lead to me also being more curious about the content that I'm learning about because as I learn more, that could benefit. But
Mm,
there is a pushback. We don't want to define curiosity in terms of the reward. We want to define curiosity in terms of this sort of more intrinsic motivation without the promise, without the lure of a tangible reward.
mm. I mean, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but I just feel like that this content material is honestly so important because I feel like really thinking about learning itself places everything else we do in education into context. Because without having like it doesn't have to even be right, but without having to, you have to have some flushed out theory of learning so that you can then say, are we accommodating education to fit into that particular theory? Otherwise, you're kind of just shooting in the dark and you're like, I think this is what learning is. Learning kind of looks like this, and those theories will obviously evolve over time, but it's so important to have these things laid out. So, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing all your insight.
Thank you so much for your kind words. And yeah, I hope that the world also agrees with you and that funding for the education sciences is restored and that there are people that are able to carry out that work because it's really important. It's really important for us to optimize our educational systems given the learners that we have, so that we have a pool of job applicants or a pool of adults who are actually contributing back to our society. So agreed and thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you all for listening. I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation. And as per usual, stay re-educated.